Hello, this is Kelsey, and we're here again with conversations with microphones. Not having the conversations with the microphones, we're having conversations with each other, and the microphones just happen to be here. But I'm joined again by Ryan and Nathan, and today we're going to be talking a little bit about critical thinking and forced apologies. So it was kind of where we left it off last time.
Yeah.
We were talking about Socrates and how he's essentially forced to kill himself.
Right.
And so maybe there are times where people don't like your critical thinking, and maybe there's a forced apology that goes on there, or maybe just something that people try to use different methods to challenge the way that you do things. And so I think we have a video that we're going to watch that's something that's kind of interesting for the conversation today. So I'll leave it there if you guys want to say something to kick it off as well.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it helps to have an example. And it's difficult to wrap your head around critical thinking without actually seeing how it applies in the real world. So I think this is probably as good a place as any to start with a video of one way of looking at the world and then see how critical thinking can be used to take a look at that.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that based off of where we left off last time, we were talking about critical thinking and how Socrates, in many ways, as recorded by Plato, kind of introduced a lot of that at his time or in his time. And there's a lot of different examples of critical thinkers over the years, but Socrates, in particular, what we joked about towards the end was he was forced to kill himself through drinking hemlock because he had introduced basically questioning authoritative figures all the way up through the gods, the deities at the time. Mm-hmm. And I think, we've watched this video before. We definitely have some reactions that we kind of want to go over, I think, today.
Yeah.
And part of that does have a forced apology in the middle there. Mm-hmm. And I think that it's a very salient point presently. We see that a lot in social media now, where people are asking for an apology before anything even can continue. Mm-hmm. And I think that for the purposes of our conversation and critical thinking, we're really not necessarily looking at apologies as a bad thing, but more that the idea of putting power towards this apology and that nothing can move forward in argument or conversation before an apology is made in the exact way as prescribed, that it is really not a good way to continue conversations, or really a good way to be able to even respect difference of opinions, because it does kind of force things to pause and really isn't giving the latitude towards differing opinions and an argument as a whole.
I think so, yeah. And I had kind of looked up a little bit about epistemology last time because I sort of just defined it as the quest for truth. And I was reading another article on Britannica about, their kind of take on it. And it was interesting that they really brought up sort of Greek philosophers as well, and the way that they were looking at it as, the sort of, study of knowledge, if you will. And so I think that's an interesting article to look at as well. And one of the things they did mention was the perspective of the observer and the sort of observer test. And, they were bringing up in the way that, if a doctor says, well, hey, this might hurt a little bit, there's really no way for them to know what it's going to feel like for you, what your level of pain is going to be. And so I think that's an interesting perspective too, but at the same time, when you talk about, epistemology, or, sort of the study for knowledge and how we define what knowledge is, there has to be something that we, again, talking about last time, there has to be something that's sort of at least tries to seek out a more or less objective viewpoint. And we can use the word objective in the loosest sense of the word. At some point, we have to try to take notes and compare our realities to each other.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's how knowledge is gained in the first place. I mean, how we define what a fact is, or how we define what knowledge is really through shared experiences. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, what ultimately we're trying to get towards whenever we talk about different things as facts. We're saying that this is something that has been shared through a lot of different unique human perspectives. And I think that's ultimately like some of the things that we're trying to talk about here. And especially with respect to this video, I think that there's a call to action here that I think is probably it really more betrays that there's not an understanding of what is being sought out with respect to science in particular.
Yeah. Well, without further ado, let's go ahead and kick off what we're talking about here. So,
let's do it.
Take the next round. Okay, so can I respond to your submissions, because I wanted to directly respond. I was actually thinking about this coming here because I thought that it was going to be one of the coming questions. How do we even start to decolonize science? Because science is true because it is science, and what can you do? And my response to that was, if I personally were committed to enforcing decolonization, science as a whole is a product of Western modernity, and the whole thing should be scratched off, especially in Africa. So if you want practical solutions to how to decolonize science, we'd have to restart science from, an African perspective, from our perspective of how we've experienced science. For instance, I had a question for all the science people, is there's a place in KZN, Mkabialingana, and they believe that through the magic, the black magic, you call it black magic, they call it witchcraft, others, that you are able to send a lightning to strike someone. So can you explain that scientifically? Because it is something that happens
all right. So I think, right there before we get into the rest of it, because I think the second part, coming up is what we were talking about.
Right.
I think there's some reactions that we even had up to this point that maybe we want to cover real quick. So right off the bat, she kind of says that she is against this for a circular logic, argument, which we kind of covered last time. Mm-hmm. She says, well, I don't think that you can say that science is true just because it's science, and mm-hmm. I agree. Right. Yeah. And this is in something else. Somebody else I was listening to the other day was saying, well, you can't just say listen to the scientists because, science changes and science disagrees with itself and it's not a monolithic block. And I actually agree with that. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, somebody else was pointing out that science is a process. And so if you say, well, listen to the science, you're saying, okay, whatever way that goes. I think both can be true at the same time. You have to be able to acknowledge that, yeah, sometimes we get things wrong and it self-corrects and, we figure it out. But you also have to recognize that, yes, sometimes we get it wrong. Sometimes mm-hmm. we just don't know. And certainly you can't say that science is true just because it's science, and now I feel like I'm saying the word science a lot. But
science. Well, I was actually curious. In the first part, she says something about dehumanize science. Is that what she says?
I think it was decolonize, or I don't know.
Yeah, the word was decolonize.
Okay. Decolonize?
Okay. Yeah, so my interpretation of that, which I hope is at least somewhat accurate, is that she's drawing a line from the empirical, not empirical, the empire of the United States and the particularly Britain, to colonize other countries, mm-hmm. particularly Africa.
Well, she does say that
Britain,
too. Like she says that she wants to restart science from an African perspective.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So and I took notes. She said something about wisdom identity, and saying like you would have to decolonize science and then quote start from an African perspective. Mm-hmm. So that's an interesting take, and I think we should try and examine that from a critical thinking perspective.
Sure. And one of the things I think that is kind of missing, even in her own statement there, is that she's made a supposition that Western science, as she is essentially a colony or colonialization of thinking. And that it's been oppressed specifically upon various minorities, but then she proposes not something that is like uniform. She's proposing a very specific subset of thought and experiences as something that really should be, that's where you should start from. Mm-hmm. Which in its own right kind of is a little bit of dichotomous. There's Aboriginals, for instance, who have, I would say an equivalent level of kind of history and cultural perspectives, and probably have an equivalent level of cultural identity and thought processes. And she's not hearkening to going back towards something from Australia or New Zealand or otherwise. And I think that there's, at least in how I'm interpreting this, it very much is kind of a very singular focus. And I think that that's part of the reason why it doesn't really make sense that you're thinking along the lines of restarting science if you're just going to say, I want to get rid of this and replace it with this perspective over here.
Well, and the example that she brings up is she says, okay, there's a tribe in Ghana that says, they essentially believe in a black magic and that they believe that, if they want to have lightning come down and strike somebody else. Mm-hmm. And she says, well, how do you describe that?
How do you explain it?
Yeah, how do you explain it? And I guess she's saying that that's a reason why science needs to be scratched off, as she says, and that, we shouldn't hold credence to that. But then if that's true, she starts out with it like, okay, well, we shouldn't believe science because it's science. Well, then doesn't that also mean that we shouldn't believe black magic because it's black magic?
Right.
I mean, the same argument holds here. It's still circular reasoning. And so we clearly need some other way of looking at these things and saying, okay, well, if I believe that I can have lightning come down and strike you, does it actually happen? Is it repeatable? We have science and we have the empirical method, which is I make a hypothesis, I test that hypothesis, I get a conclusion, and then I write up my research and have somebody else look at it and then see if they can reduplicate my test. So in this case, I hypothesize that I can have black magic send lightning down to somebody else. Does that actually happen?
Right.
So,
well, and I think that, in there too, she also says that that these people believe this. Like, this is something that they believe, and they believe that if they do this at this location, that they ask for black lightning to strike somebody, but then she doesn't actually conclude with that. And then, of course, it strikes somebody. So how do you explain that? It's just that people believe this in that area of the world. And I think that that's kind of the reason for science in the first place, is that you're not necessarily excluding that. In fact, I would even argue that part of the reason why you ask those kinds of questions is you want to know, okay, I'm doing this thing and I'm expecting this result. Does that result actually happen when I do this thing? That's kind of what science as a method and as a process is trying to inform humanity.
Yeah.
And I think that that's kind of what's missing here, is that she's asking for science to explain a belief system. And really, science as a whole is not intended to explain beliefs.
Or even saying that, science doesn't work because it doesn't explain that. And I would say that, it kind of does, right? There are certain areas of science that I would say leave that off the table,
right.
Because it's not repeatable. And so that's why we use the word belief, right? And so, I think that they really object to the guy in the back of the room saying, well, it's not true. And kind of goes back to what we talked about last week. And so it's...
the forced apology portion. And I don't think that we got to that here, but, he's clearly kind of having a similar reaction to what we're thinking here too. It's like, well, how can you possibly show that is something that can be true? You believe that this happens, and maybe he's kind of taken it to the extreme. Like he doesn't know for a fact as of right now that is something that cannot be done based off of his limited experience.
Sure.
And if we were to kind of give credence to that statement, then you'd want to, from a scientific perspective, go to that place, ask for this thing, see if it happens.
Yeah.
Not necessarily say, that's not true from the back of the room.
Yeah.
But he is kind of taking, based off of a 2016 perspective, probably a little bit more of a, I don't think that this is something that it exists because we probably would have some cell phone footage, or we would have some more social
eyewitness accounts.
We would have a lot more data, and we don't have that data. Right. So he's saying, I know that I have never seen this data in my lifetime.
It's probably really easy to say that I believe if I, pray to whatever black magic god there is that I can
Right.
send lightning down to somebody else 1,000 miles away. It's a very easy thing for me to believe if I have no capability of getting to the place 1,000 miles away.
Right. Yeah. No kidding.
I don't have to be proven wrong. I
Right.
can just believe that it happened.
Yeah.
So there might be something that happens there too.
So just to backtrack, in case we don't have video feed for this, this is a YouTube video called "Science Must Fall?" ? And it was uploaded, as Ryan mentioned, in October of 2016.
So as to your point, we can't necessarily see what actually happened like 1,000 miles away. If you're trying to assume that by going to a place and thinking that by doing something that you're able to affect somebody 1,000 miles away, yeah, you're not going to be able to see that was something that actually happened. The guy, just in the same way that the guy in the back of the room here is saying, that's not true. He has not gone there for as far as we know.
Right.
And he certainly is, he doesn't seem to indicate that in this video, as we'll see and hear, because he is essentially in this next segment that we're going to go into forced to apologize to the entire panel for making a statement that said that is not true. Now, going to critical thinking, of course, he's not really taking into account the fact that science, he's not quoting anything. He's just saying something. He's kind of jeering in the background. So it's not wrong for them to take a pause and say, hey, please don't do that. What we're really talking about here is that there's a format associated with this forced apology that has kind of come into the current modern conversation.
Well, here, let's watch it.
Yeah.
Okay, why don't we go watch it?
I can't tell if she wanted a high five there or something.
Sorry. I need to address you directly. When we started this, we agreed on certain house rules. And
Sorry.
by you doing that, you're disrespecting the sacredness of the space. And so I'd like to ask you to first please apologize to the panel directly. And then number two, understand the rules that we went by in this space. Because it's going to be very problematic. When we started, this is not an antagonizing space. And so what you're trying to do is collapse the space and make it antagonizing, which we will not allow. This is a progressive space for people to say their opinions. And we have noted how those opinions are going to be laid out. So I would like you to first apologize and then go on and agree to abiding by the rules of the space. Otherwise, I would, if you're not willing to do that, I'd please ask you to remove yourself from the space. But those are the rules of engagement of the space.
Okay, I'm very sorry to the panel.
Okay, and you agree to abide by the rules of the space. Thank you. Please carry on.
So
All
I
right,
will
so I'm
finish.
going to pause there. So I think we can just talk about the apology part of this before they go out in the sort of third section of this, which I think is also interesting. So you were kind of saying there's a format, and I think, Nathan, you might have been counting on your fingers how many times the guy actually said, was it three?
Three. Yeah, he apologized 3 times.
I think it might have even been more than that, because there was like several sorries in the background and then like the final sorry.
Well, and before, this is a 4-minute video, 4 minutes, 14 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
That essentially, that entire segment starts around 1 minute,
so
2.
3 minutes.
So it's basically a minute and a half, because this is now presently where she starts to go into this next, her next portion.
Mm-hmm.
The kind of the head of this panel essentially addresses this man in the back of the room for a minute and a half over this whole apology. And she's very specifically asking for a format of an apology. She's not saying like, please don't do that, and this is not what we want. Are you okay with, we would like you to stay here provided that you don't do that again. She instead kind of goes, okay, no, I'm going to address you directly. You need to apologize now because you said something.
Re-agree to the rules.
You need to re-agree to the rules. This is a sacred space, all of these things. And I think that the item that we're essentially talking about with respect to this forced apology is that it it is making an assumption that you can't make any statements in a panel-like environment or otherwise.
Well, which is really interesting because I don't know if you caught it, because one of the things she said in there is, we set up this rules in this sacred space for people to express their opinions.
It's a progressive environment.
Well, but I mean, but whose opinions? Because, like you pointed out, like him saying that's not true, we could, I think, appropriately class that as an opinion in the context of this video. Like you said, he also did not have firsthand knowledge of the place or be able to say like, okay, I can verify that that's not true, that doesn't happen. So I think that's very, very valid, right? And so you could say, well, look, you don't really know these people. You don't know that space. I mean, if have you ever been to Africa? I mean, maybe things work differently in Africa. Like, you don't know. And so from the standpoint of being able to repeat these things, I think these are also valid points that work in the context of, science, repeatability. And so these, I think that is very valid. But at the same point, if you say, hey, this is a space for people to express their opinions, well, I mean, if we say that is his opinion, we should be able to sort of have that conversation.
I think that there's a phrasing or a framing, phrasing and framing that he could have changed. And this is kind of how you learn to talk to people, I think, whenever they have differing opinions, is instead of saying that's not true from the back of the room, you might say, well, how am I supposed to know that that's what we should be using as a basis for this future decolonized science perspective?
Right.
I think that if they're willing to entertain a dialogue, and he's coming with what is being classified as a Western perspective scientific approach, how is it that he can frame something that can actually allow for a dialogue to continue? And I think that both of these instances are kind of a critique. The forced apology is one way of getting people to not say something that you don't want to hear. The other is also knowing your audience whenever you're making a statement. They're clearly not interested in hearing somebody say that's not true or making a statement. What really you want to do in that instance is probably to phrase it more along the way that they have their dialogue set up. I mean, again, if this is not a space that you created, you kind of do have to adhere to the rules within the space. But there are ways to question the things that might be brought up in those spaces.
Yeah, right. And I think that's a really good point. So every space, every group that meets is going to have certain rules like that, whether it's the boardroom in a corporate environment or the classroom or church or wherever. What's interesting to me is she's talking about sacred space, which sounds like a religious context. And the environment does not seem to fit that to my way of thinking because they're in a classroom. And so she's talking about opinion, and with that apology, if you interrupted someone or spoke out of turn, say at a boardroom, someone would say, oh, hey, can you just save the questions to the end? It might not even mandate an apology. No. It would just be like, please wait your turn. And then it would just be a simple redirect. But this was a minute and a half of talking about sacred space, and either you observe that sacredness and the rules that go with that sacredness, or you leave. And so is she really talking about a minor infraction of the rules, or is she talking about a kind of heresy that was committed because someone disagreed with a sacred opinion in a sacred space? And so there's kind of a confusion or a conflating of what rules we're following, at least in terms of traditional rules of a classroom.
And I would agree. I mean, I think whenever I was listening to that and watching it on this YouTube clip, you can tell she is asking for essentially an adherence that is in some ways a bit more strict than what might be interpreted from the classroom setting.
Typically in a classroom, I feel like we expect people to question things and say like, okay, well, how do we know that that's, what something we should follow or not?
Right. Well, and I think that it's important to know that I think what she's asking for is kind of almost the boardroom level where it's like, hey, don't do it that way. These are the rules of the space kind of deal. But also a little bit more like the panel is saying something and you need to listen. So don't say something that's going to interrupt that, which kind of has a little bit more of a stricter or possibly even a religious perspective. Because you wouldn't be interjecting in the middle of a sermon or something to that effect, right? And it is interesting to me to kind of see that, because if this was something that was actually being brought in a different environment, like let's say a parliamentary procedure, or perhaps even from a democratic like Congress standpoint, like those things are still like these types of interjections, things like that. When you put people in a room and they have different opinions, they're still going to want to express those opinions.
Right.
And we see that across the board. I
No
still
pun
think,
intended.
yeah, I think that there still is a desire to adhere to the rules because it is kind of good decorum, and that is how you ultimately can talk to somebody a little bit without having adverse reactions, perhaps, to your differing opinion. But it doesn't mean that you have to go through this whole forced apology to get to that point.
Yeah.
I think that you can have a slip up, and I think that it's just a very poor way of getting to a good way of conversing with someone.
Mm-hmm.
If you just immediately stop everything and say, you need to now do this before we will even allow you to stay in the space.
Yeah.
It seems like the best outcome of something like this would be the unintended consequence of silencing dissent.
Mm-hmm.
So it's one thing to say, hey, follow the rules, but something at this level, if I were that person, I wouldn't say another word until the procedure was finished.
What would be the point of saying anything at that point? Because now you've basically been put on the spot as somebody that is not a rule follower, as well as somebody that really shouldn't even be respected in the space. Mm-hmm. So now you've gone like 2 levels beyond what they did to you. Not only have you, they interrupted you, but what did they really do? Did they attack you? I mean, if it wasn't an attack, it seems like as if it was more of like, okay, I didn't adhere to the rules. My apologies.
Well, but maybe it was an attack. I mean, especially, and I think that's a perfect thing again to sort of cue up the third part, right? Because this is the response that we get in follow up to that. So here we go.
Maybe it was perceived as an attack. You mean?
That
exactly.
Response is the reason why I am not in the science faculty. I did science throughout my high school years, and there was a lot of things that I just, but it's fine. But Western modernity is the direct antagonistic factor to decolonization, because Western knowledge is totalizing. It is saying that it was Newton and only Newton who knew or saw an apple falling, and then out of nowhere decided that gravity existed and created an equation, and that is it. For whether people knew Newton or not, or whether whatever happens in Western Africa, Northern Africa, the thing is, the only way to explain gravity is through Newton, who sat under a tree and saw an apple fall. So Western modernity is the problem that decolonization directly deals with, to say that we are going to decolonize by having knowledge that is produced by us, that speaks to us, and that is able to accommodate knowledge from our perspective. So if you're saying that you disagree with her approach, it means that you are vested in the Western and Eurocentric way of understanding, which means you yourself still need to go back internally, decolonize your mind, come back and say, how can I re-look at what I've been studying all these years? Because Western knowledge is very pathetic, to say the least. I, from a decolonized perspective, believe we can do more as new knowledge producers, as people who are given the ability to reason, or whatever is that people say we do when we think or rationalize. So decolonizing the science would mean doing away with it entirely and starting all over again to deal with how we respond to the environment and how we understand it. Thank you.
All right.
Well, I mean, it's interesting that she brings up Newton's formulas, and that somehow Newton's formulas themselves are now have to be accepted, regardless of background, regardless of like Western Africa or Northern Africa or otherwise. I do find it interesting that she chose that specific example, because in many cases, gravity and ultimately is one of the biggest things that we not only have questioned over and over again and tested repeatedly. But it's also helped with different things like understanding how you're able to fly. And
Right.
that's something that you can actually see on a day-to-day basis. With
Right.
very, very little exception, you're able to see something out in the open flying. Heavier than air flight is actually
Yes.
something that is repeatable and is actually part of not only knowing aerodynamics, but also understanding gravitational interactions. So it is interesting that she kind of criticizes that particular item. But I do think that her point on decolonizing her mind or your mind as part of approaching science as a whole, I think that whenever I hear that and whenever I see kind of the reaction that she had to the "that is not true" statement that was done in the back
Yeah.
of the room, I think it was more because she is essentially asking for a cultural and acceptance or possibly inclusion that, as far as she's seen and based off of her high school education there, that it was not looked into or perhaps not even acknowledged. And I think, if we were to go and look into that specific place that she talks about with respect to black magic and lightning and what have you, maybe there is somebody that looked into it from a scientific perspective.
Mm-hmm.
But again, perspective is kind of maybe a poor word. Scientific analysis or really...
Well, and perspective maybe is the right word. I mean, that's what she's advocating for, is some other system to explain these kinds of things. But I think when she says, well, Newton just out of nowhere, her words, came up with these laws to
Right.
define gravity. Well, I think that we can all agree. I mean, I think the three of us have, traveled many different parts of the world, that gravity more or less operates the same in Africa as it does in the United States, as it does in Europe. If I drop something, it's going to hit the ground. It's not like the sort of laws of gravity just change from different geographical locations across this planet.
Right.
So saying that, some Western person can make up a set of rules and, people from Africa didn't have input. Okay, but that doesn't mean that it's different there. Now, if you can come up with something of how lightning strikes in Africa that's different than the U.S., hey, I'm all ears. I'd love to know about that. It's really interesting.
I think
right?
a lot of people would actually
Yeah,
know.
no kidding,
Well, I mean,
you know?
it would be a very fascinating fact
Yeah.
if it is indeed a fact that is repeatable and something that you can see.
Exactly. And so that's the thing, is from whatever perspective you have, if that's somebody in Africa and that's their perspective, you need to be able to convey that and communicate it with other people in a way that gets them to believe that it is true as well. And most of the time that is, replicating it in some way that, there is some evidence that we can see that it's, working, or that there is at least even somebody else that can tell us that we've seen it, or that they've seen it rather. So, I mean, there are those kinds of things. And we talked about this. So one of the things I pulled up here is Newton's laws first appeared in his masterpiece that was published in 1687. And in that time, we have seen all kinds of questions about gravity, from Einstein coming along to looking at how gravity works with, the theory of relativity and, time and space, and, theorizing about gravitons, but never actually being able to prove it. It wasn't proven until, even more recently, they were able to come up with some of the measurements that were able to observe that. So, I mean, in terms of like using gravity as an example in science, I mean, this is not something I think that, any scientist in the last several hundred years since Newton has said, I can put my sword in the ground and say that I absolutely know this.
Well, what's interesting is in this particular Britannica website that
Yeah.
you've actually pulled up, Newton's laws were actually replaced in
Right.
the 20th century
Yeah.
by quantum mechanics and relativity, and both of which I believe were actually founded based off of Einstein's
Right.
theories of
Exactly.
relativity and various scientists around that same time frame. Again, this was because the physics, and really specifically astrophysics, did not, like, looking at the Earth was one thing, but looking outside of the Earth and looking at the things that were actually happening beyond, the the actual laws of gravity that Newton purported in the 1600s needed to be modified. And I think that that's really what's kind of missing even from this clip and the perspective of that decolonizing something. Personally, I think that there's not really a good way of saying that Newton's laws themselves are actually trying to have some sort of colonizing impact, because we're talking about gravity here, and it's something, again, like you mentioned, you can go across the world and you're going to see that things fall to the earth pretty much everywhere. In fact, probably everywhere. But I think that what she's asking for is more of a look into other areas of the world and to be able to analyze those and to maybe use them as means to understand different perspectives. I don't think that that's a wrong request. I think it's just more that she's going towards something that maybe isn't. It just really isn't taking into account what science has actually done in these other areas that are really have nothing to do with a cultural perspective.
I have some thoughts on this. So I don't have a test preloaded for the black magic claim that was made in this video. However, I think there's others like it. One of the words that you used she used it in the video was decolonize. And it's hard to know exactly what she means by that. There's a certain flavor that I get from that the British Empire colonized the world and totalized the available information. And in critical thinking, one of the things that comes to mind is the concept of debunking. So it seems that she's making a claim of how do we remove things that are totalizing and perhaps incorrect or disrespectful or not inclusive of other opinions and perspectives. So you look at something like in the 80s, there's this faith healer named Peter Popoff. And he was someone who claimed to have the spiritual power to heal people of their cancer or their infirmities or whatever. And this magician, James Randi, said, well, I think that's not actually what's going on. And so he investigated and he found that there was a radio frequency. And when he tuned into a certain radio frequency, when he was sitting in the church of Peter Popoff, he could hear a transmission going on telling people which row they were sitting in and what ailments they had, so that Peter Popoff could look like he was doing something magical. So with science, there's this idea that we're actively trying to discriminate in a effective way to determine which ideas are worth standing on and are reliable, and which ideas are less reliable. So I would be interested in learning more about this decolonizing thing to see if there's actually a way that it's effective at removing ideas that are maybe not so reliable.
Well, I mean, I think one of the issues that I see with this is that it is very much tied to identity and saying that I object to something purely on the basis of who came up with it. And I think, when we talk about some of these things, I'm not sure that replacing things in that way is any better than, some of the sort of objectionable sort of concepts that we see now, right? So if you say that it's objectionable in one way to look at a group of people and make assumptions about them, I think that it's also objectionable to say, well, I won't believe it unless a certain person said it. I mean, I think that that's really a bad test for how we observe reality and try to glean knowledge and assumptions from it. If we say, well, Newton can't be trusted because he's from the West, and so we need to have somebody from Africa to make these claims, well, why is that? And I mean, is the person in Africa really going to come to a different conclusion? I mean, are they going to say that if I drop an object that doesn't go to the ground? Now, I know that's simplistic when we talk about gravity and how complicated it is, especially talking about quantum mechanics and so forth. But again, that would be an interesting test. If you have a group of one people over here look into it and a group of people over here look into it, do they really diverge that much and come up with completely differently wild theories? And is that really the best way to do it? Wouldn't it be better if we just said, hey, all of you, instead of working separately, if you could all work together on this problem, wouldn't that be better?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I liked your point too, about how the decolonization of the mind kind of thing that she's talking about. It seems to me that there is definitely a thought that something has happened with respect to science and the critiques of things that has just excluded some portion of culture and some portion of human experience. And I think that it's a valid question to have, but I think that it's good to go beyond just the question, and to maybe start to assert some of those, like to your point, Kelsey, just replacing one person's perspective because you don't appreciate their background with another person's perspective from a different background that you would respect doesn't really give you anything different. It's not really, again, Nathan, to your point, it's not really changing how you can go about investigating and proving something. You can't and we haven't looked into what decolonized science is asking for, but is that particular technique going to be better at proving something right or wrong factually and taking human experience into account and saying, okay, these are repeatable events? That's something that we can certainly look into.
I would agree with what you said. And also, Kelsey, I think you made a really good point that it seems that the argument is coming from a place related to identity, particularly from the origin of Africa or where it came from. It seems like there's a fallacy associated with that. I think a genetic fallacy is maybe what they call it, and maybe special pleading is in there somewhere. We should probably get into what those fallacies mean in a later time.
Well, and I think that that's probably something that we can attack in our next segment.
Absolutely.
We can talk more about the different fallacies associated with sources, and what kind of gives that authority, or authoritative fallacies, as well as maybe diving a little bit more into what this decolonized scientific approach really is.
Absolutely. I think the fallacies in the context of our conversations are going to be a great thing to keep looking into. Genetic fallacy, basically looking at something from where it came from, I think is a great thing to talk about a little bit too, especially in the context of this video. And so, I think that tees us up perfectly for our next conversation.
All right,
great.
Thanks a lot, guys.
All right.
Have a good one.